just to remind us of where we are, we're talking about adaptations that organisms have to transport, move things around. We had been talking about humans now. We talked a little bit about some general information about the blood. We left off, we had just went over sort of the circulation within the human circulatory system. So let's just kind of review that before we move on. Where the blood that's coming from various organs and tissues of the body, where does that enter the heart? Raise your hand if you could tell me which part of the heart accepts the blood that's coming from various tissues throughout the body. Which chamber of the heart?
Oh, the left. The right atrium.
All that blood comes into the right atrium. The atrium are the entryways. An atrium is like an entryway. Like if you ever heard of a hotel atrium, that's a term for like the main like lobby area you walk into a big building. Sometimes it's called the atrium. Atriums are entryways. So the blood that's coming from various parts of the body enters the right atrium. Where did this blood come from?
The upper lungs. Shows the lungs.
Lower parts of the body. That blood came from the legs and the torso. This blood came from the brain. Okay, the arms. Okay, all enters into the heart in the right atrium. The right atrium. So that blood, describe the blood that's coming from those areas.
Deoxygenated.
It's deoxygenated. It has given up already to the various parts of the body. It's given up its oxygen. It's taken in CO2 and other waste. And so it's coming back to the right side of the heart. The right side of the heart is the part that deals with deoxygenated blood. So that blood comes into the right atrium. The right atrium contracts. Squeeze that blood through a valve into the right ventricle. Okay, the valves make it so that blood can only flow in that direction. It can't go backwards. When that right ventricle then contracts, that forces the blood through another valve and through the pulmonary artery. Where's this blood headed? To the lungs. So this is blood that's deoxygenated. It has carbon dioxide. It has to go to the lungs to get sort of recharged. So it goes up through this pulmonary artery, which branches, one to the right lung, one to the left lung. Raise your hand if you can tell me what happens to the blood in the lungs. What goes on in the lungs once this blood actually gets there? Raise your hand, please. David?
The oxygen diffuses into the capillaries.
Okay.
And then is sent out to the rest of the body.
Okay, what else? Another gas. Jaden?
CO2 goes into the capillaries.
Yeah, so there's this exchange. So the oxygen from the air that was inhaled into the lungs diffuses into the blood. Carbon dioxide that was dissolved in the blood diffuses into the air when we exhale it. So we have that exchange. Now this blood we would be called oxygenated blood. That happened in lungs. So that blood is going to come back to the heart. But this time, where is it going?
To the body.
Well, it's going to head to the body, but first has to come back to the heart. What part?
Pulmonary areas.
Left. Atrium. Atrium are the entryways. Comes through these pulmonary veins, which bring the blood into the left atrium, which contracts and sends that blood to the left ventricle. When that contracts, it sends the blood through the aorta. That blood is headed where? Muscles, brain. It's headed everywhere, basically, to deliver oxygen and nutrients to cells of the body and to take away their waste products. And then the process just repeats. So that's the overall picture of circulation in the human body. All right. So So let's talk about the blood vessels. Blood vessels are kind of split into three big categories: arteries, veins, and capillaries. And they each sort of fulfill different functions. We'll talk a little bit about that. So, arteries. Arteries are the blood vessels that carry the blood away from the heart. So help remember, a artery, it goes away from the heart. Most of them carry what type of blood? Oxygenated. Most of the arteries are carrying oxygenated blood away from the heart. But there's an exception, because which artery that's going away from the heart would carry deoxygenated blood?
Pulmonary.
The one that's headed to the lungs, right? Because it's bringing this blood from the heart out to the lungs to be recharged. So the pulmonary artery is the exception to that. Typically in our bodies, our arteries are a little bit deeper in our body. Okay, they're not like right at the surface. Like if you look at your hand, you know, what you see on the surface of your hand, those are veins, not arteries. Arteries are typically deeper in our body, protected a little bit. And damage to an artery can be dangerous. So damage to an artery could lead to heavy bleeding. If you ever seen like a video game or in a movie and somebody gets an injury and blood is spurting out of it, that's an injury to an artery. Because every time the heart pumps, it increases pressure in the arteries, and then that pressure, if there's a damage, leads to bleeding. They're made of muscle, layers of muscle tissue. They're smooth, they're pretty elastic, they can stretch quite a bit. Because they have to withstand the pressure. When the heart beats, it forces blood into the arteries, which puts a lot of pressure on those blood vessels. So they're pretty strong, pretty elastic, if they're healthy. When you feel your pulse, okay, that's your artery you're touching, or you're close to your artery, because every time your heart beats, pressure is building, your arteries expand because they're elastic, and you feel that when you feel your pulse in your neck or in your wrist or wherever. There are diseases that affect the arteries. Okay? Diseases of the arteries can be dangerous, especially if they're arteries that serve the heart, parts of the brain. So one thing is the buildup of cholesterol and other fatty plaques in the arteries, because that can narrow the flow of blood through that area. Aneurysms, when those arteries weaken, they're no longer as elastic and they have swelling in those areas. But when that swells, the wall of the artery is thinner and more likely to damage. Here you see sort of an overall diagram of the arteries, and you can see these are the major arteries that take the blood from our heart, delivered to the various parts of our body. Obviously, all parts of our body need blood, so they're all served by arteries. If you look at this, this is a diagram just of the aorta. Right? This is the blood that was coming from the left ventricle. And so what happens is this is the largest blood vessel in the body, the thickest blood vessel. And that heart model, it was the one that comes out of the top. Where is that model? That's somewhere. So as blood flows through the aorta, so that's this red artery at the top, okay, it branches off. Okay, and you have these various arteries. These two, the carotid arteries, are the ones that go up each side of your head here that deliver blood to the brain, the carotid arteries. Okay, the subclavian arteries, here and here, they branch down to each arm. The aorta then goes like behind our heart. It's not really in this model, but this would loop back behind the heart and goes down. It's called the descending aorta. That would be branching off, delivering blood to the torso, and then eventually down the legs and so forth. So veins, their function is to bring the blood back to the heart. Arteries bring the blood out, veins bring it back to the heart. Most of those veins contain what type of blood? deoxygenated. The exception, the pulmonary vein, because that's bringing blood to the heart, but that blood's coming from the lungs. Veins are closer to the surface often. You could see them sort of in different places. You don't see them as your heartbeat's like pulsing, right? Because they have lower pressure in them, because the heart's not pumping blood directly into them. Pressure has been relieved once they reach the veins. They're not as thick and as strong. Again, they don't have to withstand that pressure. But because there's lower pressure in the veins, they have a special structure. Okay? They have what's called valves. Okay? In our veins are these little valves, one-way doors, sort of, these little flaps. Because there's not pressure forcing blood in one direction, those valves make sure the blood doesn't go backwards. Okay? Because when the blood goes through, it can't come back the other way because of these valves. Now, sometimes those valves break down and don't function properly, and that leads to what's called varicose veins. What's happening when a person has varicose veins, they often develop as people get older, especially in the lower extremities. Sometimes people develop these like swollen veins that you can see, is that those valves are not shutting properly, and so the blood can sort of flow backwards, and it starts to pool in the lower extremities, and then those veins swell up. Okay? So it's something that happens sometimes. And then connecting the two, obviously arteries are connected to veins. It's all one system of tubes. Connecting the two are the capillaries. Capillaries are extremely important. They basically surround all of the tissues of our body, have a network of these capillaries embedded within them. And so you can see here, this would be an example of a very, very thin arteriole, a tiny little artery. And once the blood gets there, it travels through these networks. Okay? And then eventually, that's the capillary. And eventually in the capillary, those networks start to merge back together, and then they're veins. So the blood flows from the heart through these capillaries and then starts heading back to the heart again. So they carry blood that's both oxygenated and deoxygenated. In fact, this is where oxygenated blood becomes deoxygenated blood, because the capillaries are where oxygen is provided to the cells. So they're all throughout our body. They're very, very thin. They're just a single cell thick, and they're so narrow, red blood cells sort of have to go through single file. That's how small these capillary networks are. Sometimes if we have damage to our capillaries and we have some bleeding in those areas, that's what leads to bruises. Okay? Damage to tissue, an impact or something, can rupture some of those capillaries. Some of that blood leaks out, becomes discolored, and we can see that under our skin as a bruise. Excess glucose in the capillaries. We just learned about muscles and energy and use of glucose. One of the reasons that it's important our bodies maintain proper glucose levels, because excess glucose can damage the capillaries. And so capillaries are where diffusion happens between the blood and the tissues and cells that it's providing for. Here's a diagram that kind of shows that. Here we have blood that's flowing away from the heart through arteries. Here's, we would call this part the capillary. And as they merge back together, this would be a vein. And so what happens as the blood cells and the blood itself travel through the capillary, this is where material can diffuse in and out. So if these were like muscle cells, muscle tissue, materials from the blood can be exchanged with that tissue, and waste products from those tissues can be picked up by the blood and brought back to the heart. Also, part of the blood, the plasma, some of it gets forced out of the capillaries here and is surrounding all of these cells. We call it lymph. And it will be put back into circulation through a separate system. Why do I keep doing that? So heart disease, cardiovascular disease, is one of the most common types of diseases that affects humans. one of the leading causes of death of people. And so there's different types of heart disease. You probably learned about some of these in health class. Hypertension is high blood pressure. And high blood pressure, hypertension is one of the most common cardiovascular diseases. Excess pressure is damaging to the capillaries, damaging to the arteries and heart muscle. High blood pressure can be caused by diet, high salt in the diet, high levels of fats and so forth. Caused by stress, our blood pressure rises when we have stress. Heredity, some people just have genetic predisposition to have high blood pressure, even if their other risk factors are good. Smoking raises blood pressure. Our blood pressure rises as you get older as well, as with aging. So all those things can affect blood pressure. Medications can decrease blood pressure. There's certain medications, changes to diet, increased exercise. Those things can help to decrease high blood pressure. Did we already talk about measuring blood pressure? Or was that the other class?
Isn't that like the
Sphygmomanometer?
yeah.
We talked about it. Another cardiovascular disease, atherosclerosis, is the buildup of cholesterol in the walls of the arteries, which leads to hardening of those arteries. So they're less flexible, more prone to damage. A heart attack. So this is our heart, and you could see on the outside it has its own supply of blood feeding this heart muscle. Heart muscle's contracting, every second or more, constantly, never stopping. It needs a good supply of oxygen and nutrients in order to continue. And so it has its own blood vessels that are on the outside. They're really important. In fact, they're one of the first branches off the aorta, are the branches that bring blood to the heart itself. And if those arteries that are bringing blood to the heart are blocked or are damaged, that can have serious consequences because a lack of oxygen to the heart muscle itself means the heart can't pump. If the heart doesn't pump, no other tissues are going to get blood and oxygen, and then they will not be able to function. So if there's a blockage to that coronary artery, for example, by a blood clot or some other factor, that can lead to a heart attack. Or if the arteries have become so narrow because of the buildup of cholesterol in them, there's less blood flow to the heart, and that can lead to an inadequate supply of blood. And some of the typical symptoms of those, chest pain, pain radiating down the arm, those are sort of like the telltale classic signs of heart attacks, but sometimes people don't have those symptoms, they have other symptoms. We'll talk about treatments here in a second. Anemia. Anemia is when our blood is not able to carry enough oxygen, and therefore different parts of our body don't get a proper supply of oxygen. We get fatigue and tiredness and things like that. And that's, sometimes it can be due to a lack of iron in our diet. When people are deficient in iron, iron is one of the molecules that's in red blood cells that allows them to carry oxygen. If we don't have enough iron, our red blood cells can't carry enough oxygen. Other times it could be due to genetic conditions like sickle cell trait, which is when cells are misshapen because of mutation in the gene for hemoglobin. Different types of cancer can affect the circulatory system as well. The most common, leukemia. It's a type of cancer that affects the bone marrow. Remember, the bone marrow is where the blood cells are actually produced. Okay? And sometimes it leads to sort of overproduction of white blood cells. Here's just some illustrations to show some of the things we've been talking about. Here you see, so to take on when a doctor suspects maybe they have a blockage in one of their coronary arteries, to diagnose that, one type of test that they might do is a cardiac catheterization. In a cardiac catheterization, they take a wire and they insert it typically into one like the femoral artery or an artery in the groin. And they can actually steer this wire up all the way through this artery into their torso, loop it around their aorta, and feed this wire into the coronary arteries. And when they put that wire there, they can do a few things. So they can inject a dye and then image it using x-rays. And that's what this shows. And so they can see actually how blood's flowing. It's how they can see if there was a blockage in a certain area. It would be visible, okay, on this angiogram. You can see it. And if they find there is a blockage, that this coronary artery is narrowed in some area, they can actually then insert a little balloon at the end of this wire, and they get it to the blockage, and they inflate the balloon. That could sort of squish that plaque, opening up that artery to increase blood flow. Or they might also put on top of that a stent. If you ever know a relative or somebody has a stent put in one of their coronary arteries, a stent is a little piece of like wire mesh. And they put it at the end of this wire, and when they open the balloon, the stent opens and locks, and that sort of reinforces this area, keeping it open. They're medicated, so cholesterol and fats don't stick to them, and that hopefully will allow for them to have better flow of blood to the heart. Now, if that doesn't work, stents haven't worked, and the angioplasty, balloon angioplasty hasn't worked, well then the next level of treatment is doing bypass surgery. So cardiac bypass surgery is when there's, again, blockages that can't be fixed in these coronary arteries. So you may hear people talk about, say, oh, there's an 80% blockage or a 95% blockage in two coronary arteries. They're talking about how restricted blood flow is there. And so to fix that, doctors can take a vein, typically from a person's leg, cut it out, do surgery on their heart. They stop their heart, connect somebody to a heart and lung machine to breathe and circulate their blood, and then they basically paste in this vein from their leg. They attach one end to the aorta, and then they bring the other end down and connect it to the coronary artery. And so the blockage here, okay, this is bringing blood past that blockage. It's like taking a detour. Like if you're going somewhere, you're on the highway and there's a traffic jam, you can't get through, you can get off the highway, go around, come back on the highway, and continue on your way. That's what this bypass surgery is doing. It's taking a vein from another area of the body to bring blood past that blockage and hopefully restore the flow of blood there. Another way they do it is there's an artery in here that connects into the chest, and they can actually cut that and then reattach it here, again, past the blockage, so as blood flows through that, goes around the blockage. So those are ways of treating coronary artery disease if they can't treat it with those other more conservative methods. But if they have to do open heart surgery, it's major surgery. Like to do full open heart surgery, they need to make an incision through your skin, through your muscle, saw through your sternum, open up your chest cavity, okay, and then stop your heart, do the surgery, put everything back together. It's a very long recovery. Sometimes they can do it now using robotic surgery, using a special tool where the doctor controls the arms of this robotic surgery tool that just does puncture wounds. They don't cut open your whole body because these tools have a little camera on them and a light and tools they can use. So they put them like in through your rib cage or under your ribs, and then they can do the surgery without a huge incision. So this just shows the blockages of some of these coronary arteries. Oh, this is what sickle cell. So that disease I was mentioning, sickle cell disease, it's inherited, much more common in people of African descent, and it's a single mutation that causes hemoglobin to be misshapen, and because of that, some red blood cells take this sort of crescent shape. And those blood cells can clog up. They don't carry enough oxygen. They clog up capillaries and small arteries. They can lead to serious health issues if a person has that. We might talk more about it in genetics, but there's a reason why it's more common in people of African descent. Because being a carrier actually provides an advantage to people that live in areas where malaria is endemic. We'll just watch this last video, and then we'll be finished with it.